Hi, my name is Stella, and I'm 38 years old. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio, a place where everyone knows your name, your dog, and occasionally your secrets. For 12 years, I believed my husband, Daniel, loved me deeply. My sister, Emily, was always a part of my life, sometimes a little overbearing, but I trusted her without question. That trust shattered in a single morning, one I'll never forget. I was doing laundry when I found the messages, the kind that make your hands shake, your chest tighten, and your whole world feels suddenly fragile. I can't describe that feeling unless you've seen the people you love laughing in secret, plotting behind your back. Before I dive in, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And if you love stories about family drama, betrayal, and quiet revenge, hit subscribe because I've got plenty more like this. It was Tuesday, an ordinary day. I had started a load of laundry early, the house quiet except for the hum of the washing machine and the faint chirping of birds outside the kitchen window. Daniel had left for work, the scent of his aftershave lingering faintly in the air, and Emily had called to ask if she could borrow a cookbook I'd promised her weeks ago. I didn't think much of it, just another casual visit. But as I folded Daniel's shirts, a flicker of movement from the laundry basket caught my eye. A folded piece of paper had slipped from the pile of freshly washed clothes. At first, I thought it was a note from Emily about the cookbook. But as I unfolded it, the truth hit me like a lightning bolt. Texts between Daniel and Emily, laughing, planning, sharing something intimate I wasn't invited to. They were talking about a weekend getaway, just the two of them. I froze, staring at the words that seemed so normal to anyone else but felt like daggers to me. The initial disbelief was overwhelming. My hands trembled, the paper shaking in my fingers as I reread their messages. Every inside joke, every playful insult, every "I can't wait to see you this weekend" sentence, now poisoned with betrayal. The hum of the washing machine became deafening, each spin a reminder that my life had been turned upside down while I folded shirts, oblivious. I remember sitting down on the kitchen floor, the tile cold against my legs, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind raced. How long had this been going on? How many moments had I shared with them? Thinking we were all close, while they whispered secrets I'd never be part of. I thought about the morning before, when Daniel had kissed me goodbye with that familiar warmth, telling me to have a good day. That simple gesture suddenly felt hollow, staged, a cruel act performed for my benefit. I forced myself to stay calm, taking a slow, deliberate breath. My first instinct was to scream, to confront them immediately. But something inside me, maybe survival, maybe a spark of quiet revenge, stopped me. Reacting impulsively would only give them control, and I wanted none of it. I needed clarity. I needed a plan. As I sat there, curled up on the kitchen floor, I replayed every recent memory in my mind. Daniel had been acting a little distant over the past month, but I brushed it off as stress from work. Emily had been overly chatty, dropping hints about wanting to spend more time together, which I had assumed was innocent. Now, each small interaction carried a hidden meaning I hadn't noticed. I could almost see the threads connecting their deceit. I remembered the dinner last Friday. Daniel had been unusually quiet, fiddling with his fork, while Emily had laughed a little too loudly at a joke he made. At the time, I thought nothing of it. It was just another ordinary evening. But now, in the cold morning light of my kitchen, those details screamed betrayal. Every smile, every casual touch, every lingering look, they were all pieces of a puzzle I had never wanted to solve. The more I thought, the more furious I became, not just at Daniel, but at Emily, my sister, my family, someone I had loved and trusted, had crossed a line that should never be crossed. And yet, beneath the anger, there was a darker feeling, an emerging need to reclaim control, to ensure they would never underestimate me again. I realized then that this discovery wasn't just heartbreaking, it was a turning point. I tried to go about my day normally, forcing a calm I didn't feel. I put away the laundry with mechanical precision, keeping my hands steady even as my mind raced. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the bitterness grounding me slightly, and stared out the window at our quiet street. Children played on sidewalks, neighbors watered lawns, and life carried on. Nothing outside seemed to notice my world breaking apart inside. That contrast, the ordinary suburban calm versus the chaos in my chest, made my anger sharper, my determination stronger. By mid-morning, Daniel had called to check in. His voice was casual, full of the usual warmth, oblivious to the storm inside me. "Hey, Stella, how's the laundry going?" he asked. I forced a light laugh, answering as if everything were normal. "Good, just finishing up." "How's work?" I kept my tone, even neutral, betraying nothing. Inside, every word felt like a mask I was learning to wear expertly. I couldn't let him see the turmoil, the discovery that had shattered my life, because I needed him to underestimate me. Later, Emily showed up at the door. She was smiling, holding the borrowed cookbook, acting casual as if our relationship hadn't just been twisted into betrayal. I welcomed her in, offering coffee, keeping my tone light. She chatted about her plans for the weekend, mentioning things I knew now were part of her secret getaway with Daniel. I nodded politely, all the while cataloging her words, her gestures, every flicker of guilt that might betray her. As she sipped her coffee, I studied her face, noting how easily she maintained composure. That's when I realized something important. Both of them believed I had no clue. They were overconfident, unaware that this discovery had given me an advantage. That belief in their impunity made the situation dangerous, but it also gave me leverage. I silently vowed to use it carefully, ensuring that the betrayal would not go unanswered. By late afternoon, I had returned to the kitchen, sitting with my notebook and a pen. I began jotting down everything. Daniel's routines, Emily's quirks, the timing of their secret messages, and subtle tells I had missed. Each line in my notebook became a map, charting a future I hadn't yet dared to imagine. My grief slowly merged with focus. Heartbreak transformed into a quiet strategy. I remembered the small incidents of the past weeks. Daniel claiming overtime, Emily asking to borrow things more frequently, little unexplained disappearances or delays. None of them seemed significant at the time, but now each felt like a breadcrumb in a trail they thought I wouldn't follow. I realized the betrayal had been happening in plain sight, hidden by everyday life, and that revelation both shocked me and emboldened me. That evening, I prepared dinner for myself, deliberately leaving Daniel's plate untouched because he was late from work. The act felt symbolic, my first small assertion of control. The house was silent except for the simmering of vegetables on the stove. I walked around, cleaning, organizing, but every movement carried tension. My mind replayed the messages, each word a blade, cutting through my trust and my previous notions of family. Night fell, and the house grew darker, the soft glow of the kitchen light illuminating the notebook I had spread across the counter. I reread the messages, dissecting the tone, noting every double meaning, every casual phrasing that now felt sinister. I realized that I had to be deliberate in my next steps. The discovery had shattered my world, but it also offered me clarity I had never possessed before. Before bed, I sat by the window, looking out at the streetlights casting pools of light on the pavement. I remembered who I was before this discovery, trusting, open, perhaps naive, and I understood I couldn't be that person anymore. Something fundamental had changed. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was awakened. My family had betrayed me, but that betrayal would not define me. It would fuel the next chapter, one I would control entirely. As I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, My thoughts were a mixture of grief, anger, and cautious excitement. This was the moment everything shifted. I had caught them, and now I had the knowledge and power to determine what came next. The discovery that shattered everything had also given me the first spark of empowerment. I closed my eyes, the pages of my notebook beside me, knowing that sleep would bring no answers, only preparation for the careful steps I would take tomorrow. And in that quiet, darkened room, I made a silent vow to myself. They would never forget this moment, and neither would I. The betrayal was real, the hurt undeniable, but the reckoning had just begun. The morning after my discovery, I woke up with a tightness in my chest that refused to loosen. The house was quiet, the same quiet that had always felt comforting, but now it felt suffocating, like the walls themselves were holding in secrets. I moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, boiling water for tea, pouring it into my favorite mug, and inhaling the faint scent of chamomile. I forced myself to take slow, deep breaths, reminding myself that I needed control. Panic would serve no one here, not Daniel, not Emily, and certainly not me. Daniel came in from work later that morning, dropping his briefcase by the door, completely oblivious to the storm swirling inside me. "Morning, Stella," he said with a tired smile, reaching for the coffee I had already poured for him. My heart sank briefly at how natural his actions were, how easy it was for him to move on from the web of lies he had spun. I smiled faintly, sliding the cup across the counter. "Morning," I said, soft, neutral, controlled. Nothing in my tone betrayed the knowledge I had gleaned the day before. Every word I spoke, every glance I offered was measured. I didn't allow my anger or heartbreak to show, not yet. If I revealed how much I knew, they would tighten their defenses. I had to become a shadow, a quiet observer, while the mask of normalcy anchored the household. Daniel lingered for a moment, glancing at the calendar on the wall, then walked past me, humming a tune he hadn't noticed I disliked. I took mental notes of his casual gestures, the subtle ways he relaxed, the small habits he believed no one watched. Emily arrived mid-morning, carrying the cookbook I had lent her. Her smile was bright, effortless, as though our previous interactions had been untouched by deceit. I welcomed her with a polite hug, the scent of her familiar shampoo filling my senses. The mask I wore was seamless, warmth, courtesy, interest. "Thanks for letting me borrow this," she said, flipping through the pages with casual enthusiasm. I nodded, commenting lightly on a recipe here, an ingredient there, all while scanning her expressions for slips, for tells, for anything that revealed guilt or fear. As we sat together at the kitchen table, I noticed a subtle tension in her posture, shoulders slightly raised, fingers tapping the table almost unconsciously. A small smirk crossed her lips when she thought I wasn't looking. It was the smallest thing, but my mind registered it immediately. They believed I hadn't seen, hadn't noticed, and in that belief lay their greatest vulnerability. I allowed myself a faint, internal smile. My mask of calm and composure was working perfectly. They were underestimating me. Throughout the day, I moved through the house with deliberate purpose. I did laundry, cleaned, organized, and occasionally paused to watch them. Daniel would move about, humming or checking his phone, oblivious to the fact that I had caught his deceit. Emily lingered longer than necessary in the kitchen, pretending to search for something, and I observed her closely. Every casual word, every laugh, every gesture was now a part of the intricate tapestry of evidence I was weaving in my mind. I began to experiment with subtle psychological nudges. Over lunch, I mentioned casually, "It's funny how people think they can hide things when everyone's busy." My tone was light, almost conversational, but I watched closely for reactions. Daniel glanced up, eyebrows raising slightly, while Emily smiled nervously and looked down at her plate. Neither confronted me, but the flicker of unease in their expressions was a small victory. The masks they wore began to show cracks, revealing the faintest hints of panic. That evening, I found myself in the living room, sitting quietly with my journal. I scribbled notes about the small incidents I had observed. Daniel's glance at his phone when Emily was near, Emily's habit of checking the hallway before answering, the way their laughter sometimes ended too abruptly. Each detail, mundane on the surface, now carried significance. I realized that betrayal is rarely loud, it's subtle, layered, and hidden in the rhythm of everyday life. Observing those rhythms gave me a kind of power I had never felt before. The next few days were a careful dance of normalcy. I smiled when Daniel made casual jokes, laughed politely when Emily offered comments, and maintained an unshakable calm. Inside, though, my mind was always active, cataloging, analyzing, and planning. I noticed small patterns I had never paid attention to before. The times Daniel left the house without explanation, the moments Emily lingered at my door under the pretense of borrowing items, the subtle way they would exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Each pattern built a map I could follow for later action. One afternoon, while folding laundry again, I overheard them talking in the living room. I couldn't catch everything, but enough floated to me. Laughter, whispers, and words like "don't let her find out," and "we'll handle this weekend quietly." My heart clenched, not with shock this time, but with clarity. I now understood their mindset: overconfidence, arrogance, and the belief that they had already won. My mask of innocence had given me an inside look at their plan, and that knowledge became a weapon I intended to wield carefully. I began small experiments to test their reactions. A misplaced item here, a pointed comment there. Nothing overt, just subtle nudges that allowed me to observe without revealing myself. Daniel noticed a pen he thought he had left on the counter. Emily noticed a cookbook slightly out of place. I watched their faces for micro-expressions, the tiny twitches and shifts that betrayed tension. Each reaction confirmed that they were becoming more cautious, more paranoid, even if they didn't yet know why. At night, I retreated to my room, the quiet darkness offering a space to think. I replayed the day's events, noting shifts in behavior, changes in tone, and subtle signs of anxiety. I realized that my mask, the calm, ordinary, unassuming Stella, was now as much a part of my strategy as observation. By maintaining the appearance of normalcy, I had forced them into a false sense of security. That false sense of security would be their undoing. Small household incidents became opportunities for observation. I noticed Daniel leaving for work slightly earlier than usual, a slight stiffness in his walk that I hadn't seen before. Emily's visits became shorter, her laughter more clipped, as though each interaction carried a hidden weight she hadn't anticipated. I began recording these details in my journal, not just as evidence, but as a way to understand the patterns of deception. It was fascinating how people could carry guilt and betrayal in the smallest of gestures, the slightest variations in routine. I started preparing mentally for the eventual confrontation or revelation, however it would unfold. The mask I wore in daily life had to remain perfect. If I faltered, if my facade cracked even slightly, the advantage would shift back to them. I practiced subtle ways of appearing casual while observing, even timing my movements to catch fleeting reactions. It became almost a game. How much could I provoke without being noticed? How closely could I watch without tipping my hand? Even Daniel's casual compliments, which had once made me smile warmly, now set my mind racing. When he said, "You've been doing a great job keeping the house together," I responded with a calm, "Thanks," and let him continue, observing the pride in his eyes, unaware that I knew the truth behind his carefully constructed image. Emily chimed in with an exaggerated, Absolutely, Stella. And I smiled at her, inwardly noting how easily she continued the pretense, how invested she was in maintaining the mask that I now understood could crumble in an instant. One evening, while Daniel worked late, Emily lingered on the porch under the guise of borrowing a garden tool. I joined her, smiling, casual, and asked her about her day. She hesitated, the slightest flicker of hesitation that only someone trained to observe would notice. She responded smoothly, but her eyes darted to the kitchen window, almost as if checking for surveillance. That was all the confirmation I needed. They were beginning to sense subtle changes in me, though they still underestimated the depth of my awareness. The masks they wore were slipping in small, almost imperceptible ways. A laugh that ended too abruptly, a glance exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching, a hand trembling slightly while holding a coffee mug. I noted each detail, cataloged it, and began forming the outline of a plan that would expose their betrayal completely, but carefully, methodically, without losing the advantage I had earned by remaining calm. By the end of the week, the household felt tense in a way that only I could perceive. I moved through rooms, doing dishes, tidying counters, preparing meals, all with the same composed smile, while observing microexpressions, listening to tone changes, noting patterns. Every interaction became a study in deception, guilt, and false confidence. I realized that maintaining my mask was not just survival, it was the key to reclaiming control over the life that had been stolen from me, piece by piece. At night, I sat with my notebook, once more, pen scratching across pages, recording observations from the day. I reflected on the transformation within myself. Grief had begun to shift into strategic thinking, heartbreak into careful planning. The masks I wore during the day, the calm smiles, the polite laughter, the controlled gestures, were now part of my new identity. They believed they controlled the narrative, but in truth, I had become the unseen force, silently orchestrating what was to come. I realized something else, too. Wearing the mask was exhausting, but necessary. It forced me to step outside raw emotion, to think, to observe, to plan. Each meal prepared, each casual conversation, each act of ordinary domesticity became a tool, a way to maintain control while gathering intelligence. And in that quiet, controlled observation, I felt power I hadn't known existed within me before. Small incidents became reminders of their arrogance and my advantage. Daniel's offhand joke about weekend plans drew a faint smirk from me, unseen. Emily's nervous laughter at a minor comment allowed me to measure their anxiety. I documented, memorized, and reflected, using each seemingly minor interaction as a piece of the puzzle that would eventually reveal the truth without exposing my strategy prematurely. By the time Friday arrived, the dynamic in the house had shifted subtly but undeniably. Daniel's movements were slightly more cautious, Emily's laughter slightly tighter. I continued to move with effortless composure, preparing meals, tending to the laundry, keeping the house spotless, all while observing, learning, and cataloging. Every smile I offered, every casual remark, was a layer of the mask I wore so carefully, hiding the storm of knowledge and planning swirling beneath. And yet, beneath all of this calm, a quiet excitement began to grow. The masks they wore, the false ease, the casual confidence, the unearned comfort, were slowly cracking, revealing the first signs of fear, doubt, and insecurity. I had become the silent observer, the quiet strategist, the keeper of the truth. And as I sat in the living room late at night, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling, I felt a grim satisfaction. I was no longer powerless. The masks we wore in this house, mine and theirs, had become a dance of control, observation, and silent power. I had discovered their secrets, cataloged their habits, and understood their vulnerabilities. And though the storm of betrayal still lingered in my heart, The careful mask I wore allowed me to move through each day with purpose, patience, and an unshakable sense of impending justice. The quiet power I had cultivated over the past week now became the foundation for something larger. I knew I had to act carefully, to be precise. Patience had become my weapon, and the moment of exposure had to feel completely ordinary. So ordinary, in fact, that Daniel and Emily would never suspect it until it was too late. I sat at the kitchen table late, one evening, a faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock filling the silence. The notebook lay open in front of me, the pages crowded with observations, patterns, and subtle psychological insights. I traced my finger across Daniel's routines, Emily's subtle tells, and the overlaps where they thought no one could see. The trap I envisioned wasn't about confrontation, shouting, or aggression. It had to be subtle, almost invisible at first glance, yet impossible to ignore once it revealed itself. My plan began with a single, unassuming object, a small bottle of homemade juice. It would appear entirely ordinary, something I might offer casually during a weekend meal, something that Daniel and Emily would think of as a normal act of domestic care. In reality, it would be the key to revealing the truth in a controlled, unforgettable way. I spent the next few days preparing the bottle, researching online, consulting recipes and tips about flavor, presentation, and harmless effects that would create a noticeable yet safe reaction. It had to be completely undetectable in its appearance, with no trace of anything harmful, simply a subtle disruption that would catch them off guard, force awareness, and leave a lingering psychological impact. Precision was everything. One wrong note, one wrong smell, and the whole plan could fail. I began gathering the ingredients, moving quietly through the kitchen early in the morning before Daniel left for work. The windows let in the faint glow of dawn as I chopped, stirred, and blended, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. The scent of fresh fruits mingled with a faint aroma of herbs, creating something ordinary enough to mask my intentions. Every stir, every careful addition, was accompanied by mental rehearsal, how I would present it when I would offer it, and how I would respond to their reactions. The first test of patience came in the form of Emily's unexpected visit. She knocked lightly on the door, a casual smile on her face, as though she didn't suspect I had already discovered everything. I hid the bottle behind a stack of clean dishes, greeting her warmly, maintaining my mask of calm composure. "Hey, Emily, come on in," I said, smiling, offering her a seat at the kitchen table. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, careful not to reveal any nervousness. She nodded, setting down the cookbook she had borrowed, and the conversation drifted naturally, light, seemingly ordinary. I watched her carefully, noting the small gestures, the way her fingers traced the edge of her coffee cup, the subtle shift in her gaze when Daniel's name came up. She didn't know I was cataloging every detail, silently recording each micro-expression, each hint of anxiety or overconfidence. In that moment, I realized just how much control I had already gained. My mask allowed me to move freely, to watch, to observe, to manipulate the narrative while they remained unaware of the trap forming quietly under my calm exterior. Daniel returned home that evening, humming a tune, his coat slung over one shoulder, the casual confidence of a man who believed he could continue his charade, unchallenged. I placed the bottle carefully on the counter, under the soft glow of the overhead light, completely casual. "I made something new today," I said, as if it were a trivial announcement. "Just a little juice blend. I thought you might like." He glanced at it, curiosity flickering in his eyes, and Emily's expression mirrored his, equally casual, equally unsuspecting. The first sip they took was ordinary, unremarkable, exactly what I wanted. I maintained a calm conversation, asking Daniel about work, Emily about her weekend plans, all the while observing their reactions closely. I noted every flicker of hesitation, every slight change in posture, every imperceptible tightening of the jaw. The trap wasn't meant to hurt them physically. It was psychological, an unveiling of their misplaced confidence. I wanted them to realize gradually that nothing in our interactions was as ordinary as they thought. That night, I reviewed the day's interactions in my notebook, making note of small anomalies, a delayed response, a nervous laugh, a glance that lingered too long. I began plotting the next phase, timing, placement, subtle conversational triggers that would guide them toward awareness without directly confronting them. The precision of each detail was crucial. One misstep could reveal my knowledge prematurely, undermining the entire plan. I spent the next morning rearranging the kitchen, deliberately placing the bottle in a spot that would seem natural during the weekend family gathering I was planning in my mind. I adjusted the lighting subtly, ensuring the bottle would catch the eye without appearing staged. I tested my approach in silence, walking through the motions of offering the drink, observing their reactions in my imagination, rehearsing calm, casual responses to their inevitable confusion. Even preparing other meals became a calculated part of the plan. I moved with careful precision, chopping vegetables and setting plates while maintaining a serene smile, glancing at Daniel and Emily with casual familiarity. They noticed nothing, blissfully unaware that each routine gesture was part of a quiet orchestration, a rehearsal for the moment when the subtle trap would finally take hold. One afternoon, Emily lingered in the living room while Daniel stepped out to run errands. I offered her a cup of tea, keeping the tone casual. "It's nice to have you here," I said lightly, smiling, watching her reactions carefully. Her smile faltered for a split second, almost imperceptible, but it was enough for me to note. The mask of normalcy I wore was working, but cracks were beginning to show, and there's tiny, fleeting, yet telling. Over the next few days, I refined the details. I adjusted the timing of the weekend gathering I had in mind, ensuring that both Daniel and Emily would be present and unsuspecting. I rehearsed my interactions, thinking through potential responses to every conceivable reaction. I became a master of subtlety, blending ordinary domestic life with strategic psychological observation. Every gesture, every smile, every casual question became part of a larger plan. The trap itself was deceptively simple. The juice, the setting, the timing, it all appeared ordinary, a casual moment that could be dismissed. Yet beneath the surface, it carried an unmistakable weight. Daniel and Emily, confident in their secrecy, would sip from the bottle without suspicion, thinking it was nothing more than a refreshment. And yet, the design was such that their overconfidence would be exposed, their false sense of control dismantled without a word from me. I began documenting every interaction in my journal, recording the times of day, the exact placement of objects, and the micro-reactions that suggested internal tension. Each note strengthened my understanding, allowed me to predict behaviors, and provided reassurance that my plan was unfolding exactly as intended. I had created an invisible map of deception and control, and now I was ready to follow it to its climax. Even casual conversations became instruments in my orchestration. I commented lightly on honesty, trust, and the importance of transparency in family life. Not accusatory, just conversational. I watched closely as Daniel and Emily reacted, noting the fleeting shifts in expression, the subtle avoidance of eye contact, the tiny hesitations in their speech. These were all signs that the trap was working, that the seed of unease had been planted in their overconfident minds. One evening, Daniel mentioned casually that he had a late work meeting, and Emily expressed concern in a way that revealed more than she intended. I smiled, nodding politely, making a mental note of their preoccupation and slight distraction. It was as if they were beginning to sense a shift, unaware that it was me, quiet and controlled, orchestrating every step. Their masks were beginning to slip, ever so slightly, and I welcomed the signs with a calm, internal satisfaction. The subtle trap extended beyond the bottle itself. I began arranging small incidents around the house that would direct their attention in predictable ways. A misplaced magazine, a slightly tilted picture frame, a casual remark about cleaning routines, all designed to establish normalcy while reinforcing my awareness of their deceit. It was psychological chess, and I was several moves ahead. Finally, I prepared the setting for the weekend gathering. The table was laid casually, chairs arranged naturally, the bottle placed innocuously in the center, flowers in a vase, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint scent of baked bread, all contributed to a sense of everyday domesticity. And yet, beneath it all, the trap was perfectly poised, ready to activate at the precise moment when Daniel and Emily believed nothing unusual would occur. I spent the final hours before the gathering practicing calm, composed movements, rehearsing light conversation, and preparing my responses to the inevitable confusion they would feel. I reminded myself repeatedly that subtlety was the key. Overt confrontation would ruin the impact, diminish the psychological edge I had cultivated over days of observation. The mask of normalcy was my greatest weapon, and I intended to wear it flawlessly when the moment arrived. By the time night fell, I was ready. The trap was set, invisible but undeniable, ordinary yet laden with consequence. Every detail, every movement, every subtle psychological thread had been accounted for. Daniel and Emily would step into a situation that appeared perfectly mundane, only to discover slowly the careful orchestration beneath it. And I, Stella, would be there, quiet, composed, and in complete control, watching the subtle trap unfold exactly as I had planned. The morning of the weekend gathering arrived with the kind of quiet that made the air seem almost too heavy to breathe. Sunlight streamed lazily through the half-open curtains, brushing against the polished wooden floor. The house was calm, ordinary, and utterly unsuspecting, a perfect stage for what was about to unfold. I moved through the rooms methodically, making sure every detail was as I had planned. The living room smelled faintly of baked bread. The table in the dining room gleamed under the soft glow of the overhead light, and the bottle of juice, the centerpiece of my subtle trap, rested innocuously in the center of the table. I wore my mask with absolute precision that morning. My hair was neatly combed, my blouse casual but tidy, my smile effortless. Inside, my chest tightened, but my exterior remained serene. I moved about the kitchen, checking glasses, plates, and napkins, humming softly as I adjusted a chair just slightly to the left, details that would seem meaningless to anyone else but mattered to me. Each small adjustment added to the illusion of normalcy, and that normalcy was crucial. Daniel and Emily had to feel safe, comfortable, and confident before the trap fully revealed itself. They arrived almost on schedule. Daniel walked through the door first, briefcase in hand, still humming the same tune from the week before. His eyes flicked to the table, pausing for a fraction of a second at the bottle, then returning to me. "Morning," he said casually, shrugging off his coat. "Looks nice in here." I smiled, nodding politely, keeping my tone light, as if their presence meant nothing beyond the ordinary. "Thanks," I said softly, gesturing toward the table. "Coffee's ready too, if you'd like some." Emily followed, carrying a small bag she claimed contained snacks she had picked up on her way over. Her smile was slightly tighter than usual, her eyes flicking to the bottle as if sensing something was off, though she didn't know what. She placed the bag down and commented lightly, "The house smells amazing. Stella." I nodded, returning the compliment, then moved to place the juice in front of her casually, as if it were a trivial act of hospitality. The first sips were uneventful, just as I had planned. They tasted the juice, and nodded in approval, complimenting the flavors. I engaged them in light conversation, asking Daniel about work and Emily about a project she had recently started. I laughed at small jokes, tilted my head thoughtfully at their stories, and maintained a warmth that made everything appear ordinary. The key was subtlety. Any overt hint of manipulation or tension would ruin the effect. As the conversation flowed, I carefully observed. Daniel's fingers drummed lightly against the table, an unconscious gesture he had always used when nervous, but he had never been nervous around me before. Emily's leg bounced slightly under the table, another microreaction I had learned to notice during the past week. Their confidence was beginning to crack, just slightly, and I felt the faintest thrill of anticipation. The trap was working quietly, invisibly, perfectly. I shifted the conversation toward topics I knew would trigger subtle internal unease. I said casually, taking a sip of my own drink, it's funny how small actions can show who people really are. Sometimes we think everything is hidden, but little things always slip through. Daniel's head jerked slightly, a subtle twitch I caught instantly, though he forced a casual expression. Emily's eyes flicked to mine, her smile a fraction too tight. They didn't confront me, didn't question my remark, but the tiny reactions told me all I needed to know. The psychological trap had begun to spring. I began introducing small, controlled disruptions into the room. A napkin slightly askew, a glass not quite aligned, a casual comment about trust and honesty, all seemingly innocuous, all calculated. Each element heightened their subconscious discomfort without raising immediate suspicion. I maintained my composure completely, offering a serene smile, while mentally cataloging every twitch, every shift, every breath. By mid-morning, the tension in the room had grown subtly but undeniably. Daniel's voice occasionally faltered, a micro-hesitation before responding to my questions. Emily's laughter occasionally ended abruptly, a slight sharpness creeping into her tone. Each reaction was a small, internal victory. They were beginning to realize on a subconscious level that the ordinary reality they trusted was being quietly manipulated, and that Stella, was the orchestrator. I allowed a few more moments of ordinary interaction before increasing the psychological pressure. I poured myself another glass of juice, tilting my head slightly in casual curiosity. I wonder, I said lightly, how much people notice about the ones closest to them. Sometimes the smallest things reveal the biggest truths. Daniel's hand twitched against the table again. Emily's eyes darted toward the bottle, lingering just a little longer than necessary. They didn't speak, they didn't confront me, but the subtle unease was now tangible, filling the room like an invisible fog. Small incidents continued to unfold as I maintained the facade of normalcy. A gust of wind from the open window rustled the curtains, making a soft sound that caught Emily's attention. She shifted in her seat, her elbow brushing the table. Daniel's eyes flicked momentarily toward her, then back to me. I smiled faintly, taking another sip of my drink, observing their reactions as though I were watching a carefully directed scene in a play. Every movement, every glance, every gesture was a thread in the web I had spun, and now the web was taut, ready to reveal itself fully. The pivotal moment came when I casually suggested we try a new game I had found online, a small, family-friendly guessing game that required observation and subtle attention to detail. I smiled as I explained the rules, emphasizing that it was just for fun, a simple way to pass the time. Daniel and Emily agreed eagerly, still unaware that the game was part of the psychological pressure I had layered over the day. The act of observing each other, paired with the ordinary setting, created a sense of tension that they didn't yet recognize. As the game progressed, I introduced subtle prompts designed to amplify their unease. I asked casual, open-ended questions about choices and habits, noting inconsistencies in their answers, slight hesitations, and involuntary shifts in posture. Daniel's laughter sometimes ended too quickly. Emily's gaze occasionally wandered to the bottle on the table, then back to me, as if she were suddenly aware of a detail she hadn't considered before. The psychological impact was immediate and precise, each moment reinforcing the quiet trap I had set. A minor accident occurred midway through the game that I had intentionally orchestrated. A cup teetered at the edge of the table, and Daniel reflexively reached to steady it. The motion drew attention to the bottle in a casual, unplanned way, creating a small, natural distraction. I smiled faintly, keeping my tone light and conversational. "Careful there," I said softly. "Wouldn't want to spill anything." Daniel nodded, unaware that this minor disruption subtly heightened the tension, directing focus toward the bottle and reinforcing the invisible snare around them. I continued the game, asking increasingly pointed questions about loyalty, honesty, and the subtleties of trust. Each question was delivered with a casual tone, almost conversational, but the subtext was unmistakable. Daniel's fingers fidgeted with the edge of the table. Emily's smile wavered. Both were now reacting to my presence and words in ways that revealed internal unease, though neither could articulate why. The trap was not physical. It was psychological, subtle, and devastatingly effective. By late afternoon, I noted that the air in the room had shifted. The ordinary suburban calm I had maintained now felt almost electric, charged with tension and anticipation. I moved around the room with deliberate composure, adjusting cushions, straightening utensils, and maintaining a serene smile that contrasted sharply with the subtle anxiety I observed in Daniel and Emily. They had no idea that every ordinary action, every casual conversation, every mundane gesture had been carefully calculated to heighten their unease and prepare them for the revelation that would come naturally, quietly, and unforgettable. Finally, the moment arrived. I offered another sip from the bottle, as casual as any domestic gesture could be. "Here, try some more," I said, lightly gesturing with a small, graceful tilt of the wrist. Daniel and Emily each took the drink, believing it was just another ordinary interaction. I held my expression perfectly neutral, observing, cataloging, and savoring the subtle shift in energy that had been building throughout the day. As they drank, the full impact of the psychological trap became evident. Their eyes flicked to each other, then to me in microseconds of hesitation that revealed confusion, discomfort, and the beginnings of panic. Neither spoke, but the tension was palpable. I maintained calm, continuing a light, ordinary conversation about inconsequential topics, my serene presence amplifying the contrast between the normal exterior of the house and the internal unraveling of their confidence. Each passing minute heightened the trap. Daniel's gestures became slightly more abrupt. Emily's laughter was clipped, almost involuntary. I noted every nuance, every minor shift, every flicker of unease. The invisible threads I had woven around their perceptions were tightening, and they were beginning to realize, slowly and painfully, that nothing in this ordinary scene was as it seemed. By the end of the afternoon, the trap had fully sprung. Daniel and Emily were visibly tense, glancing at each other in fleeting, wordless communication. Their overconfidence, their casual arrogance, the belief that they had remained hidden, everything was collapsing silently, almost invisibly, but undeniably. I maintained my mask, calm and serene, the orchestrator of a subtle yet devastating revelation that required no overt confrontation, no shouting, no anger, only precision, patience, and careful observation. And in that quiet suburban living room, the moment of truth arrived, perfectly realized. The house was quiet after the weekend gathering, almost unnervingly so. Daniel and Emily had left earlier that day. each carrying a weight they hadn't fully understood, and I finally allowed myself a moment to exhale. The air still smelled faintly of the baked bread and juice from the gathering, the scent of normality and subtle revelation interwoven into the walls themselves. I stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, staring at the spot where the bottle had rested, a soft smile tugging at the corner of my lips. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of quiet control, a confirmation that the careful planning, the observation, and the patient orchestration had achieved its purpose. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching surfaces, straightening cushions, adjusting light shades, not out of necessity but as a ritual of reclamation. Each small act reminded me that this house, my life, my world, was still mine. The betrayal had been devastating, but now, for the first time, I felt that the power I had lost had been quietly restored. The invisible threads of control I had woven over the past days were still there, intangible yet undeniable, and I let myself savor that feeling. I settled into the living room, cup of tea in hand, letting the warm liquid soothe the tightness that had gripped my chest for weeks. I thought about Daniel and Emily, not with immediate anger, but with a detached awareness. The trap had worked. The subtle disruption of their overconfidence, the carefully orchestrated microtensions, had made them confront their own guilt without a word from me. I realized that closure wasn't about confrontation. It was about control regained, boundaries restored, and a silent understanding that some betrayals, once revealed, cannot be ignored. The days that followed were an exercise in quiet reconstruction. I moved through my routines with a new sense of purpose. Laundry, cooking, cleaning, all tasks that had once felt mundane now became meditative acts, each motion a reminder of my agency. I experimented with small improvements around the house, a new arrangement of furniture, rearranging the bookshelves, adding touches of color to rooms that had felt sterile and empty during the tension-filled weeks. Each act of care was a form of reclamation, a statement that I could rebuild not only my home, but also my sense of self. One morning, while sipping coffee by the window, I noticed a pair of children walking down the street with a dog. The simplicity of the moment, the sun shining, the ordinary rhythms of suburban life, reminded me that life, despite its betrayals and heartbreaks, continues. I realized that my fixation on Daniel and Emily's deception had kept me tethered to anger and hurt, but now there was room to notice beauty, to appreciate the quiet joys of everyday existence. That realization was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it marked the beginning of my emotional healing. I began journaling more deliberately, not merely cataloging betrayals or observations, but recording my own thoughts, hopes, and reflections. Writing became a mirror, allowing me to observe my own transformation. I noticed patterns in my responses to betrayal, ways in which I had been naive or too trusting, and how I had learned to reclaim patience, perception, and self-respect. My journal became a tool for understanding, a bridge between the chaos of emotion and the calm I was cultivating. Small, ordinary incidents reminded me of the depth of my growth. While preparing dinner one evening, I found myself humming lightly, a gesture of ease I hadn't felt in weeks. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting soft shadows across the counter, and I realized that I was noticing these details again, not with longing for the past, but with appreciation for the present. The house no longer felt like a stage of betrayal. It felt like a sanctuary where I could rebuild my sense of self, brick by brick, breath by breath. One afternoon, Daniel called unexpectedly. I answered, keeping my voice calm, casual, and neutral. "Hey, Daniel," I said softly. There was a pause on the other end, the faint hesitation revealing discomfort he could not hide. He asked about the weekend, about minor household matters, his tone careful, measured. I responded with polite, matter-of-fact answers, revealing no trace of my lingering awareness. As I hung up, I felt a small surge of satisfaction. I no longer needed his approval or trust. The power balance had shifted subtly, irrevocably. Emily, too, reached out later in the week, pretending normalcy, attempting to maintain her former relationship with me. I allowed a polite, controlled conversation, asking questions that seemed casual but were designed to gauge her awareness, her guilt, her self-reflection. Her answers were hesitant, carefully curated, betraying just enough discomfort to remind me that the trap had left its mark. I didn't need to confront her directly. The subtle exposure of their actions had achieved the psychological impact I intended. As the week progressed, I found myself engaging in small acts of personal reclamation. I went for long walks in the neighborhood, allowing the crisp air to fill my lungs, noticing details of the world I had neglected while consumed by betrayal. I visited the local library, picking up novels I had once loved, rediscovering the joy of stories and the comfort of imagination. Each activity, each step outside the house, became a way to reclaim autonomy, to reinforce the understanding that life could be ordinary again, even if it had once been shattered. I also began reconnecting with old friends, people who had drifted into the background during the months of tension and secrecy. A coffee with a longtime neighbor, a phone call with a childhood friend, casual lunches with women I admired, all became opportunities to rebuild my social landscape. I realized that betrayal had isolated me temporarily, but now, by intentionally reaching out, I was weaving a new network of support grounded in honesty and mutual respect. During one quiet afternoon, I returned to my garden. I had neglected it during the storm of revelation and planning, but now, tending to the soil, planting new flowers, and trimming overgrown branches felt like an act of therapy. The simple tactile motions, the soft resistance of the soil, the scent of fresh earth, the warmth of sunlight grounded me. Each blossom that emerged from careful care felt like a tangible symbol of my resilience, a reminder that life could continue, flourish even after betrayal. I also allowed myself small indulgences, moments of joy that had felt forbidden during the weeks of planning and observation. I baked cookies with a recipe I had perfected long ago, humming quietly as the scent filled the kitchen. I rearranged a few household decorations purely for aesthetic pleasure, relishing the creative control I had over my environment. These seemingly minor actions were vital. They were proof that I could derive satisfaction from life without the presence or validation of those who had betrayed me. Even at night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the transformation I had undergone. The anger that had initially consumed me had shifted into a calm awareness of my own strength. The betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also forced me to observe, to plan, to act with precision, and ultimately to reclaim my sense of self. I felt a quiet pride in my own resilience, in my ability to maintain composure while navigating a storm of deception and psychological tension. A particularly revealing moment came one evening when I encountered Daniel briefly at the local grocery store. He attempted a casual greeting, but I noticed a subtle stiffness in his posture, a slight hesitation in his eyes. I smiled faintly, nodding politely, and moved on, feeling neither anger nor the need for confrontation. In that interaction, I recognized the power of quiet closure. The psychological trap I had set, combined with my composure and regained agency, had shifted the dynamic entirely. I no longer needed to assert dominance overtly. My presence alone was enough to communicate awareness and control. Emily reached out again later, this time with a carefully worded apology. I read her message slowly, absorbing the words, noting the hesitations, and the phrasing that revealed her discomfort. I responded politely, acknowledging her note without extending intimacy or trust beyond what I was comfortable with. In that exchange, I realized that closure wasn't about forcing recognition or forgiveness. It was about reclaiming the space within myself to move forward without lingering resentment or obsession. Over the next few weeks, I established a new rhythm in the household. Ordinary domesticity returned, but now with a heightened sense of awareness and personal empowerment. Cooking, cleaning, organizing, and even casual conversations became acts of control, subtle yet profound affirmations of self-determination. I noticed, too, that the once tense energy of the house had shifted. Daniel and Emily moved more cautiously, aware on some level that their past actions could no longer be ignored, but I no longer felt the need to actively manipulate them. The subtle shift had become internalized, and my sense of safety and autonomy had been restored. I also began exploring new personal interests, things I had set aside for years. I joined a local art class, started experimenting with painting, and even considered volunteering at a community center. Each activity was a deliberate act of self-reclamation, reinforcing the understanding that my life was no longer defined by betrayal, but by my choices, my growth, and my ability to embrace new experiences. One evening, as I prepared a simple dinner, I paused to look around the home I had reclaimed. The walls, the furniture, the subtle arrangement of objects, they all reflected my regained agency. The house felt peaceful, vibrant, and ordinary in a way that was profoundly satisfying. I realized that I no longer measured my life by the actions of those who had betrayed me, but by my own capacity for resilience, creativity, and emotional equilibrium. Finally, I allowed myself a quiet reflection. Sitting by the window, sipping tea, I felt a profound sense of closure. The trap had served its purpose. The betrayal had been acknowledged and internally resolved, and my own sense of self had been fully restored. I was no longer the woman overwhelmed by deception. I was Stella, observant, strategic, resilient, and at peace. Life would continue, ordinary and unpredictable, but I had learned the power of calm, measured action, and the strength of reclaiming one's own world. As I stood by the window that evening, the sun dipping low behind the familiar suburban rooftops, I felt a calm that I hadn't experienced in months, maybe even years. The house was quiet, filled only with the subtle hum of life, the faint ticking of the clock, the soft rustle of leaves against the window pane, and the lingering aroma of the simple meal I had prepared for myself. It was ordinary, peaceful, and yet it carried an extraordinary weight for me, because this was the moment I truly recognized that I had reclaimed my life. The betrayal, the secrets, the hidden glances, the whispered lies that had once made my chest tighten with anger and disbelief, they no longer held dominion over my thoughts or my emotions. I realized that the most profound victories are not always loud or public. Sometimes they are quiet, private, and deeply internal. The subtle power of awareness, patience, and careful action had allowed me to regain something that no one could take from me, my sense of self, my dignity, and my peace of mind. I thought of Daniel and Emily, of how their overconfidence and hidden agendas had blinded them, how their assumptions of invisibility had left them vulnerable to the consequences of their own choices. And yet, I did not feel triumph in anger or revenge anymore. That moment had already passed. It had been orchestrated, precise, and undeniable, and the psychological truth was now theirs to carry. My satisfaction came not from their discomfort, but from the knowledge that I had acted with intelligence, patience, and calm composure. I had proven to myself that I could navigate a storm of betrayal without losing who I was, without letting their actions define my reality. The quiet control I now felt was intoxicating. In its simplicity, it wasn't about making them suffer, but about demonstrating that resilience, composure, and clarity could restore balance even after the deepest emotional wounds. Looking around my home, I saw every object, every small detail as a reflection of my reclamation. The sunlight glinting off the polished table, the neat rows of books, the flowers that I had planted with my own hands. All of it symbolized my renewed ownership of space and life. It was a subtle reminder that healing doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't require dramatic gestures. Instead, it is built slowly, with care, with deliberate actions, and with an unwavering commitment to one's own well-being. I understood, finally, that closure wasn't about punishing others or seeking validation. It was about embracing myself, my choices, and the knowledge that I had navigated betrayal with strength and intelligence. As the evening light softened into twilight, I allowed myself a long, deep breath, letting the tension, fear, and heartbreak of the past weeks fall away. I felt lighter, freer, as though a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying had been lifted. I knew life would continue to have its challenges, but I also knew that I could face them with a sense of self-awareness and empowerment that no one could undermine. The betrayal had been a dark chapter, but it had also been a teacher, revealing resilience I hadn't fully acknowledged and a depth of strength I now understood I possessed. I was Stella, and in reclaiming my life, I had found not only closure but also the quiet, enduring power to shape my own destiny. For the first time in a long time, I smiled, not out of bitterness, but from the deep, unwavering certainty that I had survived, I had grown, and I had truly reclaimed myself.